Montana, 1881. The men who worked for Augustus Quinn called him Gus to his face when he had been drinking, and Mr. Quinn at all other times. And the men who did not work for him called him the Iron Man of the Madison and meant it as a description rather than a compliment. He had earned the name in 1881 by foreclosing on a neighboring rancher who had borrowed against his herd in the bad winter and could not pay in the spring. The neighbor had begged for an extension. Gus Quinn had not given one. The neighbor had hanged himself in his own barn 3 weeks after the foreclosure had cleared. Gus Quinn had kept the land. He had earned the name a second time in 1882 by tracking down 2 men who had stolen a string of his horses, riding them to ground over 3 counties, and bringing one of them back in irons to the Helena Territorial Court. The second man had not come back. He had earned the name a third time in 1883 by firing his foreman of 19 years, a man named Caleb Fry, whom the rest of the territory had liked, for an act of small dishonesty involving the count of a beef contract. He had paid Fry what he owed him to the cent. He had not, in the years since, acknowledged Fry on the street in Whitlow Bend. The territory had agreed by the autumn of that year that Gus Quinn was not a man any reasonable person should disappoint. The territory had not yet understood that Gus Quinn had been a different man before the spring of 1882. His wife had died in the winter of 1880. Her name had been Jenny. She had been 31. She had taken a hard pneumonia that had not lifted and had been buried under the cottonwood at the north end of the spring meadow on the 2nd of March, leaving behind a 6-year-old daughter named Evelyn and a 38-year-old husband who had not been entirely prepared to raise her alone. Evelyn Quinn had been a small, dark-haired girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and an unaccountable talent, observed even before she could read, for the work of the kitchen. She had stood on a wooden stool beside her mother from the age of 3. She had stood on the stool beside the housekeeper, Mrs. Beach, from the age of 6. By the time she had been 7 and a half, Mrs. Beach had let her bake the Sunday loaf without supervision, and Gus Quinn had eaten the loaf without comment because he had not been able to find the words in the small house at the head of the Upper Madison for what it had meant to him that his daughter had wanted to bring something to his table. Evelyn had begun, in the winter, she had turned 8, to write down her recipes in a small leather-bound book her mother had left her. She had ruled the pages with the same care her mother had used to rule the household accounts. She had written in a deliberate first-grade hand. She had filled, by the early spring of 1882, 43 pages. She had taken scarlet fever on the 4th of April of that year. She had died on the 11th. Gus Quinn had buried her beside her mother under the cottonwood. He had taken her small recipe book from the kitchen shelf where she had kept it. He had locked it in the wooden box at the bottom of his own clothes chest in the bedroom he had not slept in since her funeral. He had not opened the box in 2 years. He had stopped in those 2 years eating any food that was prepared with intention. He ate. The hands of the ranch could not afford to have him not eat. He ate the meals Mrs. Beach put in front of him until Mrs. Beach retired in the autumn of 1882. He'd fired the first replacement cook in November for putting cinnamon in his oatmeal in an attempt to lift his spirits. He had fired the second in March of 1883 for asking him a question about Evelyn he had not been prepared to answer. He had fired the third, fourth, and fifth in order for offenses ranging from solicitude to inattention to, in the case of the fifth, a small misjudged effort to season his food the way his daughter once had. He had not, since the spring of 1882, been hungry. He had not, since the spring of 1882, allowed himself to be. 2. The new cook McKenna, the foreman who had replaced Caleb Fry in the autumn of 1883, was a slow, patient man of 62 who had been a sergeant under Gus Quinn in the Army of the Potomac in 1864, and who was the only person on the ranch by the spring of 1884 who could speak to Augustus Quinn without first being addressed. McKenna had hired the 6th cook in the second week of April without telling Gus. He had hired her from a recommendation he had received from a friend in Bozeman, who had eaten her cooking for 2 winters at the bar/spread on the Gallatin, and who had described her in a careful sealed letter as a woman of 30 years, originally out of St. Louis, broad of build, sound of temperament, and capable of feeding a bunkhouse of 30 hands twice a day without complaint. She had been let go from the bar / the letter had added, not for any deficiency of work, but for an incident in which she had spoken her mind to a hand who had been bullying a younger one. And McKenna, who had read this sentence twice, had folded the letter and put it inside his coat and ridden to Whitlow Bend that afternoon to send her a pair of wire. He had not asked Gus's permission. He had not, after 19 months as Gus Quinn's foreman, expected to be granted it. He had ridden to Whitlow Bend on the morning of the 7th of April to meet her stage. She had stepped down from the stage with a small carpet bag in her right hand and a heavy iron cookpot in her left. The cookpot carried as a woman carries a child she has decided not to set down in unfamiliar country. And she had said to McKenna before he had finished crossing the dust toward her, "You will be Mr. McKenna. I'm Pearl Lacey. I have brought my own pot." McKenna, who had been in the Army of the Potomac in the campaign of 1864 and had not been startled by very much since, had been startled. He had bowed slightly. He had taken her trunk. He had not, in the 4-hour wagon ride out to the ranch, asked her a single question that was not strictly necessary, because he had recognized within the first 10 minutes of her company that she would answer only the questions that needed answering and would do so without flourish. She had ridden beside him on the wagon bench in the warm spring afternoon. She had watched the country with the slow professional attention of a woman who had cooked in 3 other valleys before this one and who understood that the country fed the herd and the herd fed the hand and the hand fed the household. At the 4th mile, with the gate of the Quinn Ranch coming into view at the head of the road, McKenna had said, "There is one thing you should know about Mr. Quinn, Miss Lacey. I've heard most of it. What you have heard is the Territory's version. There is the part the Territory has not heard. Tell me." Mr. Quinn had a daughter. She was 8. She died of fever 2 springs ago. He has not eaten a meal prepared with intention since. He has fired 5 cooks for trying. I have hired you without telling him I was going to. He will likely take exception to that when he learns of it. Pearl Lacey had looked at him for the length of 3 breaths. When does he learn of it? When he comes in for supper this evening. All right, I shall be ready. You will not be afraid of him, Miss Lacey. I am asking you not to be. Mr. McKenna, I have cooked for a regiment of cavalry, 2 cattle outfits in the Gallatin, and a Methodist boarding school. I have been threatened by a chaplain. I am not afraid of a rancher who has been hungry for 2 years. McKenna had not laughed since the autumn of 1864. He had come very close. 3rd, the question. Augustus Quinn came in from the upper pasture at 26 minutes past 6 o'clock that evening by way of the back porch, with his hat in his left hand and his work coat over his right forearm and the dust of 9 hours in the saddle on every inch of him that had been exposed to the wind. He had been told by the boy at the corral that there was a new cook in the kitchen. He had not been told the cook had been hired. He had walked the 50 paces from the corral to the back porch in a silence the boy who had spoken to him would, in the bunkhouse afterward, describe to the other hands as the kind of silence a man walks in when he's choosing, while he walks, between 3 or 4 possible measured responses to a development he was not consulted about. He had hung his hat on the peg by the back door. He had hung his coat. He had stepped into the kitchen. She was at the stove. She was a broad-shouldered woman of perhaps 30 years, with arms that had clearly been kneading bread for longer than she had been keeping count, and a face that was round and serious and unflinching, and dark brown hair pinned up in a low knot at the back of her head that had not entirely consented to staying there. She was wearing a plain dark blue work dress under a clean white apron that was already at 26 minutes past 6 of her first day dusted at the front with flour. She had a heavy iron skillet on the stove and a wooden spoon in her right hand. She did not turn around at the sound of him entering. She finished a small, careful stir of whatever was in the skillet. Then she turned. "Mr. Quinn, madam, my name is Pearl Lacey. Mr. McKenna hired me on the 7th. I am told he did not consult you. I would not, if I were you, take it out on him. He has been carrying that decision since the 2nd week of April. He has carried it with the patience of a man who served under you in 1864. She set down the wooden spoon. She did not cross to him. She remained at the stove. I have prepared a supper. It is not on the table yet. I shall serve it in the next 4 minutes if you allow me to. I shall serve none of it if you do not. He looked at her for the length of perhaps 11 seconds. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped at the corner of the kitchen table, the same table at which his wife had sat for the 4 years of their marriage, at which his daughter had sat on the wooden booster cushion Jenny had sewn for her, at which the housekeeper, Mrs. Beach, had served him every meal of the 18 months between Jenny's death and Mrs. Beach's retirement. He set his hands on the back of the chair at the head of the table. He said, in the voice the territory had heard once or twice and had hoped not to hear again, "I will ask you one question, Miss Lacey. I will keep you on if I'm satisfied with your answer. I will dismiss you with the wages of 1 month if I am not. The wagon will be at the front step at first light. Are these terms acceptable?" "They are, Mr. Quinn." He nodded once. He did not move his hands from the back of the chair. "What do you cook for a man who has decided he's not hungry?" The kitchen was very quiet. Pearl Lacey did not, in the space of the next 5 seconds, change her expression. She did not look at the floor. She did not look away. She did not deliver the answer with any care for performance. She said in the same plain, steady voice she had used to greet him, "Mr. Quinn, for a man who has decided he's not hungry, I cook the same meal every evening until he is. The deciding is not my work. The cooking is." Augustus Quinn did not respond at once. He did not respond, in fact, for the better part of 40 seconds. He stood at the back of the chair with his hands flat on the wood, and his face did not change, but the entire interior of his rib cage went in the space of those 40 seconds, from the closed iron condition it had been in for 2 years to a condition that was not closed and was not iron, and that he had no name for, and that he was not, in that moment, prepared to examine. He sat down at the head of the table. He did not look at Pearl Lacey. "Serve the supper, Miss Lacey." She served the supper. He ate every bite of it. He did not, in the 7 minutes it took him to eat, speak to her or look at her or acknowledge her in any way he would have been able to point to afterward. But when he set down his fork on the empty plate at the end of the meal, he sat for an additional moment with his hands flat on the table on either side of the plate, and he said without looking up, "Miss Lacey, you will stay. The terms of your employment are whatever McKenna offered you. I will not interfere with them." "Thank you, Mr. Quinn." He stood. He picked up his hat. He went out by the back porch. He did not return to the house until after midnight. 4. The meals. She cooked the same meal every evening for the first 7 days. It was a beef stew with potatoes and carrots and an unobtrusive amount of black pepper, with a small biscuit on the side of the plate, served on the same tin plate at the same place at the head of the kitchen table. She did not ask him whether he had preferences. She did not vary the meal. She did not, when he came in on the 3rd evening with his coat soaked through from a rain that had caught him 5 miles up the road, offer to make him anything different. She set down the stew and the biscuit. She poured him a cup of hot black coffee. She returned to the stove. He ate the stew on the 3rd evening. He ate the biscuit. He drank the coffee. He did not speak. She did not speak either. On the 4th evening, she added a small dish of stewed apples beside the plate. He did not comment on the change. He ate the apples. On the 5th evening, the stew had been replaced by a roasted chicken with the same potatoes and carrots beside it, and a small dish of stewed apples that had become more elaborate by the addition of a half teaspoon of cinnamon she had measured with the deliberate calm of a woman who had heard the story of the second cook, and who had decided that the second cook had been correct on the principle and merely premature on the timing. He ate the chicken. He ate the apples. He looked at her once. He did not speak. On the 7th evening, she put on the table a small loaf of bread, the shape of which Gus Quinn had not seen in 2 years. It was the shape of the Sunday loaves Mrs. Beach had baked for the household. 3 small braided strands joined at one end, a recipe Mrs. Beach had brought from her own grandmother's kitchen and that Evelyn Quinn had been particularly fond of because she had been able to pull apart the 3 strands without using a knife. He had looked at the bread for the length of perhaps 5 seconds. He had looked at Pearl Lacey. "Mrs. Beach." "Yes." "You wrote to her." "I did." She wrote back. She sent the recipe. She sent her regards. She asked me to inform you that she is 68 years old and that she would like, before she dies, to know that you have eaten a loaf of her bread again. He did not, on the 7th evening, eat the bread. He set the plate aside. He looked at it for the length of the rest of the meal. He ate the chicken and the potatoes. He drank the coffee. He stood. He carried the plate of bread to the small side table by the back door. He set it down. He looked at it again. He went out. He came back at 9:30. The bread was still on the side table. Pearl Lacey was in the kitchen kneading the dough for the morning. She had not, in the 3 hours he had been gone, eaten any of the bread herself. He picked up the plate. He came to the table. He sat down. He pulled apart the 3 braided strands of the loaf one at a time. He ate them slowly in the order of their length, without speaking, while Pearl Lacey continued to knead the morning's dough at the counter with her back to him. When he had finished the bread, he said to her back, in the voice she had now heard him use 3 times, but with a register beneath it she had not yet heard him use, "Thank you, Miss Lacey." "You are welcome, Mr. Quinn." He went out by the back porch. He did not come back until after midnight. The second week was different. She varied the meals. She introduced a small variety. She made the Sunday loaf again. She made a chicken pie. She made a baked apple pudding. She made a beef pot roast that she had learned to do at the bar slash, and that Gus Quinn ate 2 helpings of without acknowledging that he had done so. He had, by the morning of the 15th day, gained back the better part of 7 pounds, McKenna had noticed. McKenna had not commented. The men of the ranch had begun, by the second week, to eat their own suppers in the bunkhouse with greater appetite than they had done in 2 years, because the cook who had previously been responsible for the bunkhouse meal, a young hand named Lemon who had been pressed into the duty after the 5th cook had been dismissed, had been instructed by Pearl Lacey on the morning of her first full day that she would take over the bunkhouse meal as well, because she had not in her life cooked for fewer than 30 people at a time, and she would not begin doing so now. The 30 hands of the Quinn Ranch, who had been eating Lemon's biscuits for 8 months, had wept openly at the second supper of the second week, which had been a beef and dumpling stew that the bar slash had paid Pearl Lacey to make, and that she had brought to Whitlow Bend in the iron pot she had carried off the stage. The recipe book. She found the recipe book on the morning of the 22nd of May, on the 4th Sunday of her employment, in a manner she had not been planning. She had been in the small back bedroom Gus Quinn had not slept in for 2 years, which Mrs. Beach had used as a sewing room in her time, and which Pearl Lacey had been using, with McKenna's quiet permission, for the storage of the small quantity of household linen she had begun to put in order for the warm months. She had pulled out the bottom drawer of the cedar clothes chest at the foot of the bed to put away a stack of folded napkins. The drawer had stuck. She had reached behind it to free the latch. Her hand had closed on a small wooden box she had not been expecting. She had pulled out the box. She had looked at it. It was a plain cedar box, perhaps 8 inches by 6 inches by 3, with a simple brass clasp and a small brass plate engraved with the initials E, Q, and the date, 1881. She had known without having to lift the lid what was in it. She had stood with the box in her hands for the better part of 2 minutes, and then she had put it back in the drawer behind the latch where she had found it. She had closed the drawer. She had finished putting away the linen. She had gone back to the kitchen. She had not that morning said anything to anyone about how she had found. She had served Gus Quinn his Sunday supper at 6. She had served him a roast beef with browned potatoes and a small dish of pickled cucumbers. She had served him the Sunday loaf in the shape of 3 braided strands. He had eaten in silence. He had stood at the end of the meal. He had picked up his plate, as he had been doing for the previous 2 weeks, and had carried it to the counter beside the sink. He had stopped at the counter. He had turned to her. "Miss Lacey." "Yes, Mr. Quinn." "There is a small wooden box in the bottom drawer of the cedar clothes chest in the back bedroom. The clothes chest is mine. The box is mine. I have not in 2 years opened it." "I know." "You have found it." "I have. I had been expecting you would sooner or later. I had not been expecting it to be the 4th Sunday." "I'm sorry, Mr. Quinn. I had not been looking for it." The drawer had stuck. "I'm not asking you to apologize." She waited. "My daughter's name was Evelyn. She was 8 years old. She had been writing in that book since the winter she turned 7. She had filled 43 pages by the time she died. The recipes in the book are not entirely original to her. Some of them are her mother's, some of them are Mrs. Beach's, some of them are her own. I have not opened the book in 2 years because I had decided I was not the person they had been written for. Whom had they been written for, Mr. Quinn? For the person who would cook the recipes. He was quiet for a moment. I would like, if you will agree to it, for you to be the person who cooks the recipes. I would like you to take the book out of the drawer. I would like you to use it. I would like you to keep it in the kitchen where Evelyn kept it. I would like you not to mention to me in advance which recipes you are using and on which days. I would like, from this evening forward, to be the kind of man who eats his daughter's recipes without insisting on knowing they are hers. Pearl Lacey set down the dishcloth she had been holding. She crossed the kitchen to him. She did not embrace him. She did not take his hand. She stopped a single pace in front of him. Mr. Quinn, I will take the book. I will use it. I will not tell you which evening I am using which recipe. I will, however, leave the book on the kitchen shelf where you can see it. I will not put it back in the drawer. If you wish to look at it in the evening, you will know where to find it. If you do not, you will not be obliged. Thank you, Miss Lacey. You are welcome, Mr. Quinn. He stood for a moment longer. He did not this time go out by the back porch. He went up to the small back bedroom that he had not slept in for 2 years. He took the cedar box out of the drawer. He brought it back down to the kitchen. He set it on the table. He opened the box. He took out the small leather-bound book inside. He set the book on the kitchen shelf beside the spice tins, between the ground cinnamon and the salt. He closed the box. He took the box back upstairs. He came down again. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Pearl Lacey. That is where she kept it, the book. I know. You knew. Mrs. Beach told me. He nodded. He went out by the back porch. He did not, that night, return at midnight. He returned at 20 minutes past 9 with his hat in his hand, and he came in by the front door for the first time in 2 years. 6. What came after she cooked from Evelyn Quinn's book for the rest of the summer? She did not, in any week of that summer, tell Gus Quinn in advance which evening she would be cooking what. She let him discover each recipe by the smell of it as he came in from the corral. He never asked. He never thanked her for a specific dish. He ate everything. He gained another 4 pounds. By the middle of July, the men of the ranch had begun, in the bunkhouse on the cooler evenings, to play cards again and to argue about the upcoming county fair, neither of which they had done in 2 years. McKenna sat down across from Gus in the kitchen on the evening of the 2nd of August. You will have to make her an honest offer, Augustus, or she will leave you in October when the bar slash sends a wire. I know. Then you will. I will. He had not done it that night. He had done it on the morning of the 20th of August at 4 minutes past 6 o'clock in the kitchen, while Pearl Lacey was at the stove starting the breakfast oatmeal, and he was at the back door putting on his work coat. He had stopped at the back door with his coat half on. He had turned around. Miss Lacey? Yes, Mr. Quinn. I would like to ask you a second question. All right. Will you marry me? She had set down her wooden spoon. She had turned around. Mr. Quinn, I will. I have one condition. Tell me. I will not stop cooking for the bunkhouse. I am not a wife who would care to be removed from the kitchen. The 30 men of this ranch ate Lemon's biscuits for 8 months. I will not allow them to be subjected to that again on my account. That is acceptable. It will be a great deal of work for the woman who's the mistress of this house. I'm aware of that, Miss Lacey. I'm not asking you to be the kind of wife I was previously accustomed to. I am asking you to be the kind of wife who answered the question I put to you on the 7th of April. All right, Mr. Quinn. Augustus. Augustus. He had crossed the kitchen. He had stopped 2 paces in front of her. He had taken her hand, the right one. He had held it the way a man holds something he had spent 2 years preparing not to be allowed to hold. They were married at the small church in Whitlow Bend on the 3rd Sunday of September, with the Reverend Hadley and McKenna and the housekeeper, Mrs. Beach, who had come down from Helena especially, and the 30 hands of the Quinn Ranch as witnesses. Pearl wore a dress the color of pale wheat that the bar/'s former housekeeper had sent her by stage from Bozeman, and she pinned her hair with the same plain wooden pins she had arrived in. And when the Reverend asked if she took this man, she said yes, in the same plain, steady voice she had used to answer the first question. The winter was warmer than the winters before it. In the third week of January, Pearl Quinn set down a small dish of breakfast oatmeal in front of her husband at the kitchen table and said in the same plain, steady voice, "Augustus, we will need to add a chair to this table by November." He had set down his coffee. "Are you?" "I am." He had pulled his chair around beside hers. He had taken her hand and held it the way a man holds something he had spent 2 years preparing not to be allowed to hold. "Pearl." "Yes?" "If she's a girl, I would like to ask you to consider naming her something other than Evelyn." I had not been planning to name her. Evelyn. What had you been planning to name her? I had been planning to name her Jenny, if she's a girl, after the woman whose recipes Evelyn used in the first 11 pages of the book on the shelf, and whom you have not, since I have known you, said the name of out loud. He had been quiet for a long moment. "All right, Pearl." She had laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh fully and without reservation. And it had been better than he had expected, which was saying something because he had spent 2 years preparing not to expect anything at all. In the late September of that year, on a Tuesday morning at 14 minutes past 6 o'clock, while Augustus Quinn was in the upper pasture with McKenna, Pearl Quinn sat at the kitchen table with the small leather-bound recipe book of Evelyn Quinn open in front of her, copying a recipe in her own hand into the back of the book. A recipe for a stew her own mother had taught her in St. Louis the year before her mother had died, which Pearl had not, in 14 years, written down anywhere. The book had begun, in the months since Augustus had brought it down from the cedar chest, to grow above the cottonwood at the north end of the spring meadow where Evelyn and Jenny Quinn lay buried side by side and where the spring grass had gone yellow with the late summer. A single hawk made one long, slow circle and dropped below the line of the upper ridge and was gone. In the small back bedroom, Augustus Quinn had not slept in for 2 years, and that he had slept in every night for the last 4 months. The cedar-closed chest stood with its bottom drawer open and empty, and the room smelled of clean linen and the small bowl of dried lavender Pearl had set on the windowsill. And Pearl Quinn, who had been asked on the 7th of April, one question by a man who had decided he was not hungry, set down her pen and put her hand on her belly and listened for the first time in a very long time without any part of her bracing for it to end.